Welcome back to another episode of the Lender Podcast. My name is Bryce, and today we're discussing what is the best model to use for your lending business, particularly either the direct placement model or the fund model. Both of these models are widely used in the lending industry, but we're going to go over kind of the pros and cons that I see and what I personally choose. But before we get into that, I just wanted to share today's sponsor, which of course is Lender. Lender is a hard money and private money origination and servicing tool. So if you're currently using Excel to manage all of your loans and your investors and your capital and everything like that, I highly recommend that you check out Lender, which you can do so by going to joinlender, lendr.com, joinlender.com, and checking that out. That's the tool that we use to manage our whole portfolio, and it's been really great. Again, you can check that out by going to joinlender.com. Okay, in our business, in our industry, there's two main lending models that I see. And one is called like the direct placement model. It's also got a couple other names like trust deed investments or co-lending or fractionalized notes. And then there's also the fund model. And for the purpose of this podcast episode, we'll just say direct placement versus fund. But if you go by a different term or you call it something else, just realize that that's what I'm referring to. So first and foremost, let's go over the direct placement model and explain kind of the pros and cons. This is the model that I see most frequently used. And that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just that I think that's kind of the first natural model and place that lenders start when they're first getting started. It's kind of just like that natural progression. But I think one thing that I have realized or learned, and I haven't really shared this in the past, I don't believe, but I personally use the fund model. And I think a lot of people are scared of the fund model, mainly because of like the hard money bankers guys. I respect them. They've got a great podcast. Go check it out if you haven't. But I think people are too afraid of the fund model. And of course, I'm going to cover that in just a little bit. But first and foremost, with direct placement, I think a lot of people don't realize that what they're doing could be classified as illegal. And I don't say that to scare you or to try and convince you to, pick one way or another, because I see a lot of people who use the direct placement model and they're just fine. They've been doing it for 20 years and it hasn't been an issue. But when I first started my lending company, I talked to quite a few different attorneys. I probably talked to 4 or 5 different attorneys. And what a lot of people don't realize is when you're carving up these notes and you're putting, 3 or 4 investors on a single loan, technically what you're doing is you're making a security, and that security falls under securities laws, which typically means that you're not doing things legally. Again, do I think you're going to have any issues? No, I really don't, because I think we're small potatoes. I think the SEC is cracking down on people who are trying to be fraudulent, and there's still ways to like do what you're doing legally. And so again, I don't think there's an issue, but there probably is a more proper way to do it. Anyway, all that to say, by definition, a security is when passive investors are making returns based off of your efforts. And when I say yours, I mean the person putting the deal together or the general partner or, however you want to refer to it. But if they're making returns off of your efforts, that is classified as a security. Now, as far as the direct placement model goes, it's actually, I do see there's a couple pros with it, and mainly from the investor side of things. So for example, let's say we have, just for simple numbers, a deal that we're going to fund. It's $100,000. You have 3 different investors. They're all divided it equally, 33, 33, 33. Or maybe you invest in it personally and you divide it 4 ways. So you each bring $25,000 to the table. One of the pros that I see is that it requires a lot of face-to-face with your investors, which investor relations is a huge part of this business. And so if you have a deal on the table and you have to call up your investors, that's actually a really good thing. I think investors want to be informed. They want to be in the know. They want to know what's going on. But with the direct placement model, it requires a lot of FaceTime. You have to talk with your investors regularly and say, hey, I've got this deal coming up. Do you want to invest? Or you can also say, hey, I've got this deal that's completing and paying off, and we'll be sending you your funds back shortly. And it's really great. And I think as you're starting to build capital, that's one way to do it, is just like having your investors trust you. That is huge, huge in this business. And I don't know if that's talked about enough. Now, aside from that, just about every other aspect of the direct placement model seems kind of like a pain in the ass to me. So I've had numerous cases where I get to the funding table and I haven't received a wire yet from the investor, or they're some other issue, and that makes me as a lender look bad because now the borrower can't close because I don't have the funds from the investors. So obviously there's ways to mitigate this. If you take the funds and give them a date 3 days ahead of time or whatever, so you make sure that you have the funds, or like you can table fund it and you can fund it with your own funds and then reimburse yourself once you get the funds from the investor. There's ways to do that, but I personally don't like that model. I don't like being dependent on other people. I want to know, can I fund this loan? Yes or no, and not have all these moving pieces in the background that could potentially jeopardize the deal. So fast forward to what we are currently doing. We do have a fund. And if you are a little intimidated by setting up a fund, or if you think it's too expensive, it's actually not, and it's very simple. And I would encourage you to go and check out the episode that we did 2 or 3 weeks ago, talking about how you can set up a fund yourself. And it's really quite easy. So the benefits of the fund model that I see are, like I mentioned before, where you're doing everything by the book, you're doing everything according to securities laws, you have a private placement memorandum, you have your subscription agreement, operating agreements, your investor questionnaires. I do see a lot of direct placement lenders who have some elements of these, but not all of them. And it's just, you're doing things by the book, and it's legal, and it's not as difficult nor expensive as you might think. So I highly encourage that. The other thing too is, when you have a fund, you hang on to the funds. You hang on to the capital from the investors. And so right off the bat, do I or do I not have the funds to fund this deal? I love that. I love not having to be dependent on an investor sending me funds or wiring me funds back and forth, back and forth. I can look at the account and say, okay, we have X dollars in the account. We can fund this deal for the borrower. There's not going to be any hiccups. There's not going to be issues at the closing table. And I can perform for the borrower, which obviously helps me look better because I'm not the one who didn't pull through at the last minute. And even though it's an investor that has messed it up for you, you're the one who's going to take the heat. And unfortunately, it's your company's reputation that's on the line. So I love that. Now, one of the downsides of the fund model is the investor relations piece that I talked about before. It is definitely more difficult to keep your investors informed, just because you're less incentivized to update them regularly. And that's not to say that you can't. In fact, I think you absolutely should. But I have noticed in the past that investors send me funds, and sometimes I forget to give them updates because the funds are just there working, doing what they do, and I'm not calling up my investors regularly for capital calls or things like that. And so again, that's something that I've actively had to work on and set calendar reminders and things for myself. Say, hey, I need to shoot this investor an email, or I need to just give them a call and a quick chat, or send them a report, or something like that. So again, not difficult, not hard. It's probably something you should be doing in your business anyway, but just one small aspect of the fund model that I don't particularly love. All that to say, I do love the fund model. I think it's significantly better. I sleep better at night knowing that I'm doing everything according to the book, according to the laws. There's no issues that are going to arise with the SEC or with me potentially doing something that's not 100% accurate. And I love the convenience of having the capital on hand just to deploy as I see fit. So those are the pros and the cons in my mind of the direct placement versus the fund model. I highly recommend the fund model just because I started doing the direct placement model. I saw kind of some flaws in that model, and ultimately we moved to the fund model, and it's been significantly better for us. So again, if you're intimidated with setting up a fund, go check out the episode that I did a couple weeks ago. Highly recommend it. It's really simple. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to go over anything in further detail. But that's it for today's episode. Drop us a note if you have any questions. And until then, we'll see you next week. Thanks.